Let's talk about burnishing. It is something that I think people think is way more complicated than it is. So let's take the mystery out of it by talking about what it is, when to use it, why to use it, and how. Now, burnishing is where you get right to the end of your drawing and you want to blend all of your colours together. It's where you've built up a lot of layers of colour already and you go in at the end, you press a lot firmer, and it kind of mixes and smooths out everything that's on the paper. Now, I think it's easiest to explain what it is by thinking about what the paper and pencils are actually doing. So when you think of a sheet of paper, so I draw, for example, on Bristol board. Bristol board appears to be smooth, but if you looked at the paper under a microscope, you'd see a series of little bumps. When you put pencil down onto the paper, some of that pigment gets lodged in these bumps. And the more pigment that you put down, the more gets in the bumps. Eventually, those bumps fill up. This is why when you first start drawing, you can see all of these little white spots on the paper. It's the bumps. Burnishing would be where you filled up the pigment as much as you want to and you want to flatten the tooth of the paper. What it essentially does is mostly stops you from being able to put more pencil down on the paper. In actuality, you can get a little bit more down, but not to the same degree that you can before you burnish. So that's roughly what it is. Let's talk about when you would use it. Now, I mostly use it because I want to blend something out. I want to make it look really smooth. So that means that I don't always use it. I don't always want things to be completely blended out smooth. But when, for example, I was drawing this rose petals are generally pretty smooth and I wanted it to look smooth. So I did burnish this rose and you can see what a huge difference it made to the petals. I also did it when I drew this beetle, for example, because I wanted the card to be as smooth as possible. I wouldn't, for example, do it on this mouse because I want to make sure that I'm keeping all of the details of the fur, and smoothing that out isn't going to help me do that. So let's cover how you do it. And I want to show you by drawing these cherries. Now, before we get going, if you want to draw these cherries or any of the drawings you've seen in this video with me, they are all available on my Patreon. It is my goal to try and help people improve their drawing. So I do some really in-depth tutorials that you can follow along with me. Now, every drawing is split into manageable chapters. I give a really in-depth overview of what I've done and why, and then there's also the real-time footage so you can see exactly what I did with each pencil stroke. I also always show which colour I'm using at any point in the drawing. So for every tutorial, I include that in-depth instruction, also all of the real-time footage, details of all of the colours I'll be using. I also include sketch outlines and, of course, the reference photo. There are loads of tutorials that you can choose from, some from as little as under 2 hours long, and then I've got some really big, more complicated drawings that are over 12 hours. Do check out the link in the post to find out more. So let's draw these cherries and I'll show you what I need to do kind of prep wise to get these ready to burnish, and then we'll burnish. I can't stress enough, it is all about the prep. This is what I mean by the prep. If you try to burnish at this point where I have a tiny bit of pencil down on the paper, it's not going to look anywhere near as good as if there's a lot built up and already a lot of depth here. So with these cherries, I'm initially going through in exactly the same way as I usually would, building up some base layers and just getting something down on the paper. And once I've started building up the first parts of the colour, I can really start going in with a lot of other colours to build up a decent sort of framework. So for example, starting off here by building up a little bit more red, particularly on the top half of the cherries, and really starting to mark in where the lights and the darks are going to go. And then my general rule, as it always is with layering, is I like to start with the lighter colours and work my way towards the darker colours. So the red is actually, I would say, quite light. I'm doing quite a light green here, marking this in. And then I can start working my way down through, this is a kind of reddish brown, to build up those shadows a little bit more. And then I can move on to a much darker brown. So I'm kind of speeding through this. This is exactly what I would usually do in terms of layering. If you do want to go through the process that I use for layering, I will pop a link in the description with a video that goes into layering in a lot more detail. But you can see that that darker brown is really building up on the cherries. And I'll also build up some of the dark brown, get some of these darker colours on the stem as well. From there, moving on to a darker green on the stems. And I don't want to forget to add some of the more obscure colours as I'm doing my layering here. So for example, I'm going to put a purple in here just to make that red a little bit richer. And also it's very good for the shadows to cool them down a bit. So I keep working my way, building up that colour. You can see we're starting to get some more vibrancy. It's still not where it needs to be for burnishing, but we're certainly getting closer. And then as I've worked up towards the darkest colours, I'm just at this point going to pause for a second and maybe make a few areas a little bit more vibrant. So going back over the red and brightening it up, I'm still not burnishing at this point, but I am needing to press a little bit firmer just to build up the colour a bit more. So it's when your drawing looks about this point that you can start thinking about burnishing and blending everything together. And what I want to do is start at the darker colours and work my way towards the lighter colours now. So we're working our way back through pretty much those same colours. So I'm starting off here with the black, and I'm only wanting to put this on the absolute darkest areas. So for example, where these two cherries are meeting, here I'm doing a very small amount of burnishing. So I'm pressing much firmer in that just little corner. And then I'm lightly using some of the same pencil just to blend out from that point so that it's not a really harsh sort of transition. Now, what I think is really important to remember is that when you're burnishing, you don't necessarily want to burnish the whole thing all with the same colour. You wouldn't want to burnish the lightest areas with the black, obviously, but you also wouldn't want to burnish the darkest areas with the white. We need to find appropriate colours for each area. So right now you'll see that I am using the darker brown. And I'm not so much burnishing here, I am just adding some final shading. That's on these lighter areas. Where I move to the darker areas, so around here for example, you can see that I am pressing a lot firmer and I am burnishing this area. Now let's move on through some of the lighter colours, because I think it is going to become a lot easier to see what I'm doing. So here I've moved on to the purple pencil because I am working my way from those darker colours towards the lighter colours. And again, you can see that I am pressing much firmer here. I'm pressing firmer towards the darker area, towards the edge of the cherry, but then still lightly blending that up because, as I say, I don't want there to be a really harsh line. Now, as always, I am blending and pressing firmly for my burnishing using circular motions. I don't want to make, again, really harsh lines in any way. And by using circular motions here, it's just making the whole thing look much smoother. Then from here, I can move on to the red, and I'm wanting to burnish on most of the top half of the cherries. So I'm wanting to avoid a lot of the light spots and just really fill in and burnish the top half of the cherries. You can see that that is smoothing everything out. I can also go over the purple area a little bit, and that's going to help just blend the red into the purple a bit better. You can see that it's slightly toning down the purple and just really smoothing it out. But I am leaving all of the lighter areas. So for example, around here, I'm not pressing as firmly because I'm going to want to blend that with a lighter colour. So I do the same to the other cherry. And then from here, the next colour I want to use for my burnishing will be the white. So now this is probably the most obvious difference in terms of burnishing. You can see that it's really smoothing out the light parts of the cherries. You can still see all of the colours that I built up, but it's really smoothing it all out. I'm slightly going over the red around the edge here just so that it's a little bit softer. But we will make a few other adjustments in a second once I've done all of the white. So I'm using it on both the lighter parts of the cherry as well as this area, which isn't as light as the light spots above, but I do want it to be lighter than if I burnished with the red. You will notice that it's making quite a harsh line around the edge though. So once I've gone over all of the cherries and burnished all of these lighter patches, what I'm going to do is go back to the red. Now, as I mentioned, it's not as easy putting other colours over the top of a burnished area, but you can see that it is slightly changing the colour. So I'm putting this red over the top of the areas that particularly that I blended with the white, and it's just making it that little bit brighter red and blending the white a bit better into the surrounding areas. But I won't be able to put a huge amount over the top, and it doesn't feel quite as easy to do this. But that is really all there is to burnishing. So by the time that you've burnished your drawing and done any final adjustments, you should have a really smooth set of cherries in this case, or whatever you're drawing. But hopefully that kind of takes the mystery out of burnishing. I think is something that people think is much more complicated than it is. If you'd like to learn more about the layering process and how we get to the point of burnishing, do check out this video here. And as always, happy drawing guys, and I'll see you in the next one.